Hello and welcome to Dancing with Water. I'm your host, Teresa, and I'm here with my co host, Jennifer Mulak. And today we're excited because we're joined by Ben Brown. Let me introduce you to him a little bit more formally before we get into our conversation. Ben is a sound practitioner, visual artist, and New York State licensed massage therapist whose work resides at the intersection of art, healing, and ancestral resonance. Blending vibrational sound, visual expression, and conscious experiences, Ben creates immersive offerings that provide refuge from social emotional isolation and invite the mind and body into deeper states of presence, spaciousness, and awareness. Guided by the belief that sound art unites inner wisdom and collective memory, Ben crafts listening environments, emphasizing the felt sense of vibration and its capacity to recalibrate consciousness and the nervous system. His method explores how frequencies and our senses reconnect us to intuition and the innate wisdom embedded in our bodies. He offers individual and group sound meditations and self care workshops. He currently practices in New York City and in the Hudson Valley, where Jennifer and I are located. And we have had the pleasure of collaborating with Ben. Ben has joined the annual O Positive Sound and Reiki experience that happens in the fall, early October. I'm like, which date? I think it's October 10th this year when we will be doing that. Um, and more recently, Ben and I, with our collaborator Vinny Calandria, have done sound baths at this beautiful location in Kingston, New York, in Tempo. And I'll do a little plug here for our next one, which is happening September 6th. So I've known Ben for a while through his sound work. And we've also had a chance to chat a little bit about the feminine. And so I was excited that Ben said yes to going on this little journey with Jennifer and I to learn more about him and how and why he does his work and to talk a little bit about the feminine and the masculine. So thank you, Ben.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Let's start out with the probably easier questions, the more clear questions that have
Sure.
clearer answers or easier answers. Just curious about, from my understanding of your kind of trajectory, you started work as a massage therapist and have over the years added and built more of the sound work. But I guess just curious as to where you entered in to the healing modalities, and maybe that's not the right language that you use, but if it was the massage work or the sound work, how did you enter that? What made you want to move into that kind of work?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I have a degree in journalism, which I never really used. And I was doing retail for many years, managing stores. Last big thing was an Indonesian import furniture store in Soho, probably some 25 years ago now. And at the time, I hated the job. And I remembered that I had this plan that I was actually going to backpack for Europe. I was going to go to massage school. I was going to massage people, and then I was going to become a lawyer. And none of those things happened. Uh, and so I ended up realizing that I hated this job that I was in at the time, and so I went back to the idea of massage therapy, which was the first sort of step to that little ladder. And yeah, when I found myself in that space, I realized that I was actually home. That was the place that I needed to be. Um, and then in subsequent years, like doing your branding for your business and stuff, I realized that actually touch has been a very much a part of my life since I was a child. I was always the person who was caring for people. I used to massage my friend's father. He came home from work. He was a longshoreman, and he would have me walk on his back and crack it and do all sorts of things. My father was a New York City Transit bus driver. He always had aching feet. I cared for his feet, and so I realized, much later in my career, but I realized that like touch and care has always been sort of a defining factor for who I am.
That's really interesting. And maybe this is, uh, an obvious question or with an obvious answer, but how would you say you knew that it was the place that you were home when you found the massage work? Like what was that knowing? How did that show up for you?
Um, I would say it was in terms of the interactions with other people. It was the really connecting with another person. It's the situation that, like in body work, it's one on one, and it's go time. So you're in the room with someone. There is no turning around. There is no turning away. I mean, obviously you can walk out, but if you do, then you don't have a career and it's over. So, it's a situation where literally I had to, connect with people incredibly quickly, find ways to make people feel safe as well as actually keep them safe, and then care for their bodies when they're presenting themselves in an incredibly vulnerable way. And what I found was that it really resonated with me, this sort of care, this sort of nurturing, attending to, came very natural. And, early in my career, I had successes that, led me to believe, okay, I can do this. I can do this. And since then, it's gradually built into, a different situation where I still feel, like, oh, nervous about every person that walks in a room, even if it's a client that I see, weekly. I still am always concerned about that experience. But now that over the years of doing it, there is a certain amount of trust in myself and in the situation of also knowing, I will do the best that I can in this situation, but also knowing that I don't hold the cards of healing. That's really a space that's kind of beyond me. It's just my place to be a conduit and hold space for people.
Jennifer and I have both talked about our kind of career pivots in different previous conversations. And I'd just be curious to go back to that idea that you went to school for something and and then it never became a career for you. Was there a point where you made a conscious decision that I'm not going to pursue this, or did you do some of it and it didn't work out? Like, how did you embark upon this study and then just leave it behind?
Yeah, I think I was someone, well, my sister, I was actually, I just want to get it correct. I'll say it this way, because my sister did go to school. I was basically the second person in my family to go to college, period. So I had no real reference as to like what a career is or what it was going to be. My family were blue collar workers. And so the whole idea of college itself was a sort of this like opening, but at the same time, like no direction. I always loved writing. I always loved reading. And so journalism sort of became a place to sort of focus so that I could actually finish school. Because I actually went in as a poli sci major. I was very much interested in political science and law, which is interesting because even now, even though I have none of those things in my background, as I'm following the world, like I am constantly consumed by political podcasts and all the things that are going on in the world. And so clearly there's some sort of interest in my heart there. What happened was when I graduated, I was involved with a relationship that the person had a child already, and it was like I needed a career. And in journalism at that time, I could make a whole $12,000 to contribute to a family of three. And I would have to move way upstate, like much further than where we are here. I can't remember exactly where, but it was like up near like Buffalo or something. That was the only place I was able to get offered a job initially. Obviously that's kind of how it works. Is usually you start at a small paper, at least at that time, before the internet exploded and everything. But at that time, you started at a small paper and gradually worked your way up. And that path was much too long when you already had an instant family. So I ended up just abandoning that, doing retail, and that's where I was at for a number of years, like 10 years or so.
Okay, so you are in your field, you're feeling aligned with your field of massage therapy. When does the sound work come in, and how does that come in?
Yeah, so I've been in massage therapy. You have to take continuing education classes, to keep your license up to date. And I don't remember exactly the time. I think it was like maybe 2018, 2017, around that time frame. I looked and found a course that was talking about using sound instruments in your practice, tuning forks, singing bowls. So I took that study. I actually studied with Katie Down at the time. That's how I met Katie, and MJ and Joseph Smith. And I know you know all those people, Teresa. So, but that's how I ended up in that circle. Was through the course, and I didn't really do much with it until COVID happened. When COVID happened, my clients were reaching out to do something like, "Hey, I need help," and I'm like, "I can't touch you. I can't see you. What do you want me to do?" And finally, it dawned on me. I was like, "Oh, I could start using these practices here." So I started actually doing Zoom uh, sessions for my clients using the three singing bowls I had. That's all I had at the time. And then gradually, when things opened up, the world started to go again. I actually started to bring it further into my practice. During that time, I also started doing some studies on my own. It was also a peer group, and Alana Bell, who I've worked with a lot. We started to practice together over Zoom, and then eventually we came together in person. So all those sort of pieces came together, but COVID was really the sort of catalyst to get me to really like move forward with the sound.
One of the aspects of what you offer, I think, is your social media presence actually has some very beautifully curated sound experiences, and really of all types of sound, of streams of nature, etc. And I wonder if you've always had a noticeable relationship to sound in a certain way. Like, where are your early memories of your relationship to sound, or is that something that sort of was awakened through your studies?
No, I think it's a combination of things and how you define it. You know, Now my work is around like deep listening and sound healing and those sort of practices, sort of meditative aspects of sound. However, my entire life has really been consumed by music, like most people or a lot of people. I was the kid who sat there with a cassette deck and was trying to catch the songs before they ended on the radio, and then mixing and making mixtapes. I ran the radio station in SUNY New Paltz for a number of years. I was a DJ. I produced concerts at the college. I worked in a record store. So music has always been a part of my life. And I think in that it's also an appreciation because where I would talk that sound and sound healing and wellness is what I'm doing now. I actually believe like listening to salsa or dancing to some dub or some hip hop or a static dance, like all those things is sound healing. So it doesn't have to be this sort of like woo-ness wellness. The idea of sound and music and also obviously nature are ways that we as humans can connect to the greater being of the world and also to ourselves. So I feel like in that definition, it's all of it coming together, and sound has always been very much a part of my life. What I did discover that I would say is that I realized that I had never really performed because I had some really bad experiences early in my life as a quote, budding musician, once as a drummer. And then also, I had a really terrible experience trying to learn cello in middle school. But both of those experiences I realized were to me harmful in such a way that I did not feel like I could pick up an instrument. So, body work, which made me feel safe and gave me a place that I felt very comforted in, gave me space to come back to actually performing sound. And so sometimes people will say, "Oh, you're a musician," and I will always shy away from that. I'm not. I'm a sound practitioner, and I think some of that comes from the wounding from earlier experiences in music and music studies.
How would you differentiate that definition of a musician versus a sound practitioner? Like what do you mean by the difference in that?
Yeah, I think in terms of there's the aspect of like the study of music, music theory. There are people who that's what they've done, and they have spent so much time in that. And my approach has been more about experiential, and it's more about how sound is either a meditative practice or how sound can be a catalyst for us to find ourselves in terms of like how are you experiencing this, like what does this sound elicit in you. If it does elicit something that is, fearful, then how do you sit with that for a moment? Or how do you experience that and connect to your own body? So for me, sound is more of a tool that can blend or move towards musicianship, but that's not the space that I sit in.
Hmm. 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 So as a sound practitioner, it sounds to me like what you're explaining is very much connected to your work as a massage therapist, where you're, because that's, your entry point, and then you're bringing the sound in as another way to connect to the body. Would you say that's true, or to connect to
No,
sensations?
yeah, no, I think it's a fair assessment in terms of that. I think that for me, it's a really easy pivot that I can see how those two work together. I think that the idea is connection and presence, which is such an important part of being human, and is such a disconnect, I think, for a number of people for a lot of different reasons. I know we'll touch on, the defining factors of masculine and feminine, but I think that's one of those things in terms of that is that disconnection that people have to themselves is sort of those reasons why I love both touch and sound as modalities or as mediums to allow us to come back to those spaces.
Because we're talking about this, I want to ask this question. Doesn't mean we have to leave the work that you do, but when Jennifer and I talk about the masculine and the feminine, we often talk about the feminine as being an embodiment and sort of the masculine being more of the logical mind, analytical space. And being in your body, being aware of what you're feeling, being aware of how the body feels, and this is where masculine and feminine and male and female kind of get a little bit crossed, not always, but um, there's sort of this, I don't know, I want to say trope, but it's sort of like a, a more common experience for women to be able to be embodied and to be in touch with their emotions and aware of what the body is feeling, whereas men generally are less so. And you may disagree with that statement, and that I think from what I know of you, you s- seem to be more embodied and more in touch with your feelings and how the body feels. And so I'm curious about your experience, not about sort of how we define it or how all men are, but in your experience, is that something that has always been there? Or is that something that you've consciously developed or unconsciously developed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always been there. I think I've always had a certain sensitivity to others. I've always had this sort of empathetic space where I'm very much aware of other people and the surroundings and how things go. I think there are some things that, as I am now just thinking about it, with this question, that are some are about safety and some that are about who I am as an individual. Meaning, like in some places, to be safe as a black child, I'm going to go back to that sort of thing. You have to. I was predominantly in white spaces. I grew up in Staten Island. I grew up in an Italian, uh, German, Irish neighborhood. I listened to heavy metal. I was sort of an out. I was always marginalized on the outs, even when I was in. Like just because of all these different intersecting things. And at the same time, I've always had this sort of like love of the arts. I think I would say that way. I think that creative aspect and sort of the empathy has allowed me to have space to sort of feel into and connect to things that way. It's always been a part. And then, you know, there was a time I remember where I was very angry and realizing that I was going to, like, I had this destructive aspect of me that I needed to squash. And so I really like made an effort. I was probably like around 13 or 14. I remember I was walking down the street and some guy looked at me like wrong and said something like I don't even remember exactly what he said, but he said something. And like, I just remember wanting to like punch him. And then I was like, I can't do this, like I can't be this person. Um, And so so there's been this constant sort of like trying to, lack of a better word, get better or be better about things, and in that way connecting. So I feel like it's always been a part of me. I just think that as I've aged, and then my profession, like I said, when I found body work, it was a way to like, oh, that makes sense. But it was always there with like even early writings and stuff like that. This nature of um, connecting to my feelings, um, not always feeling that I can express them. So I think that there is somewhat to be said about the male aspect of not being able to express themselves. But I also knew that there was more to it, and that I could make a choice. And so there was that. I was also a single parent mom, so a lot of women in my life. There was a time where there was a little turmoil in my early teens, where my family was like shaken and stuff. My parents were divorced already at that point. And I went to live with my aunt for like I don't know, like 6 months or so. And, so it was a lot of like nurturing through that kind of space. We read a lot. She used to actually, just like I had my own room, I just sat and watched TV or did what I wanted to do. So it was a lot of freedom to kind of just sort of explore and see.
So would you say that this kind of empathetic side of you that you're describing as kind of always having been there, would you say that it was nurtured through your upbringing at home, through your mom and your aunt and the female people in your life? Or was it something that you really needed to dig down and work through kind of on your own?
No, I mean, I think those things were nurtured. They were encouraged. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I was supported in that aspect. I mean, one of the things that I like to sometimes like to tout in stories is how I was allowed to express myself as a child without too much criticism, or there were definitely rules and what have you. But at the same time, like I would sit with my mom and we would have many a conversation about things. And I was always the guy who like had a lot of like girlfriends, but not like, what I mean by that is I mean friends, like girls that were like my friends. And like my mom would always be like, why are they always calling you? I'm like, I don't know. We talk, I can talk to them, they can talk to me. She's like, and it was like I've always had a really easy rapport with women and girls that has I think shaped my early upbringing. And I'm not saying that I think that I'm sure I did plenty of dumb things that every other guy has done, but at the same time I also learned a lot, like talking to all these girls at the time, and be like, oh, don't do that. She doesn't like that. Girls don't like that. Don't do that. Why would you say that? That's really dumb. So so I think I've been shaped and nurtured by the female presence through my entire existence, that has both allowed me to express and to shape, to be, but it's also given me space to also like um, reflect, and realize that there are spaces to grow and there's other places to go. So I think that those two things. And what I was going to say about the weird thing is that I grew up in a Pentecostal family, very highly religious Christian family, and I went to college and I came back with like black nails, wearing a skirt, and my mom didn't bat an eyelash. She was just like, oh, okay. And so it was a very interesting upbringing, that I was able to just be who I wanted to be without um, much criticism internally. The world thought I was a freak, but my mother was always supportive in such a way that always gave me space to just keep going and just being who I wanted to be.
Mhm. Mhm. I'm thinking about how the safety that you describe helping other people feel in your spaces seems like something that you grew up with, right? So you seems like you always had this space to feel safe to be yourself. And now you're offering that to other people.
Yeah, I don't think I saw that, but yeah, I would agree with that. And and it's not that everything was safe. I'm not going to paint rosy pictures. Like I said, the family was broken up at the time, and but there were safe spaces, and I think that's what we all need, is like places where we can have those moments to just be seen and welcomed and cared for who we are. Like when people come into my room, a lot of people will be like, "Oh, I didn't shave today," or "Oh." I didn't get a pedicure, or, oh, do you, like, I'm this size. And I'm like, none of that stuff matters. Like, it just get on the table and let's see what's going on. Let's see how to make you feel better. Let's help your nervous system calm down. Like the focus is really just on you being, however that is, um, so that you can actually connect to yourself.
I'm curious to know. I feel bad kind of pivoting in this direction because what you're describing is just very lovely, and it makes me think of like when Jennifer and I were thinking about doing this podcast. One of the major motivations is about inspiring a more caring community because there's
Mm.
such a lack of it in the world. So I'm just appreciating everything that you're saying, but the question comes up for me about what your relationship was like. You talk about having a lot of relationships with women, with girls, relating very well with women. What were your relationships like with men? Did you have male friends? Did you struggle because of the way that you were showing up in a male body?
Um, it's interesting. I didn't necessarily struggle to have male friends. I just didn't have a whole lot of male friends. So it's in that kind of space. I think there's some things that I don't necessarily relate to, that didn't work for me as much as like I love sports. I'm not like fanatic about sports. Like it was never like this thing like, oh my God. So there were spaces that didn't work, but I also think that there were, it like if I was to count on my hand in my life, I probably have had maybe five people that I would say of the male perspective, male, physical being that were friends, that have carried through. A lot of people are acquaintances. I actually don't have a whole lot of friends in that kind of context.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so I think and maybe it's choice or maybe it's my own sort of like um, disconnection or disassociation with it. It's funny because you just made me think of something that it's a really odd thing, but it's a really funny thing. I actually don't like the smell of men, which it's a really I know it's a very odd thing. I think men smell terrible, and like even when I start to smell like a guy, I'm very much like, oh, so it's a very very strange sort of thing. But yeah.
Not to gross any of the listeners out, but like, how does that show up? Like, you get in a room with a guy and you're like, you just smell it. Do they always smell? Because I don't think I've noticed that. I mean, certainly there are times, but
No, I mean, no, I mean, we're all in society, so I mean, it's not like I'm not around it, but it's just the like the musky smell of a man, which a lot of people would find very attractive. I actually find it very repulsive. And I like I said, I know I admit it myself, so that's why I shower a lot. I get teased by my partner because I well, not anymore, but I used to get teased when I first met because I actually like floral deodorants and stuff. Like I wear a lot of feminine sort of things because that's where my senses are. So I mean, maybe it's just it's part of that sort of like what's the makeup? I mean, but then again, it's like I said feminine, so I think, but how do you define what's feminine? I mean, like I think that's one of the aspects that we have. It's like we label these things and say, oh, this is feminine, but it's like I'm I like myself as a male presenting person, masculine, but I also like floral things. Like they make me happy, they smell good, they make me feel good. Like literally, it's like a trigger. Like I can smell like a rose, and that makes me feel joyous, and I can smell musk, and I'm like, oh, you know, what does that mean? Like so. I don't know.
yeah, and that's where it can be hard sometimes for us to have the conversations about the masculine and the feminine because there is a lot of overlap in the what we've traditionally characterized as feminine as it relates to women and masculine as it relates to men. And I think you're hitting on something is that in some of those categories, it's that women have been given permission to be a certain way. And
Mm,
so we have categorized it as feminine, um, even though that may not fit my definition of feminine tracks more along the yin kind of category, whereas
mhm.
the masculine tracks more in the yang as a way of sort of separating it out from the gender. And I don't know, where is floral in the yin and the yang? I don't know where it fits in that place. um but I think that um it's an interesting time to be alive when we talk about non-binary presenting and trans. As somebody who is like, you know, cis hetero, I don't know what it's like to feel like that in a body. um but I think some of it is wrapped up in what you're talking about, and the fact that you felt safe and maybe even strong enough to be able to enjoy the things that you like, regardless of what is common for other men, I think is what the world is needing right now, is to create more safety for people to like what they want to like and respond to things in the way that feels natural to them versus what people have told them is important because of their gender.
Right.
um but because we've kind of folded the feminine word in at this point, I'd be curious of how you define it, or how do you think of the feminine?
So, in preparation, I've been thinking about this, and to me, I feel like it's creative energy. Um, I liked the definition that I went through an earlier podcast of yours, an earlier discussion where you were talking about the internal and the external. I think that those sort of definitions sort of fit. I think there is a nurturing ability to feminine energy. I don't necessarily mean that it has to be female, but nurturing and caring, which is why I also feel like I feel very connected to it myself. Like it's a very easy sort of thing, and it's very interesting because you think about when we say nurturing, right? It might produce the idea of a mother, but then why wouldn't it produce the idea of a father if you're talking about protective, right? You'd say protective, then you go, oh, but isn't nurturing a protective aspect, or isn't protection nurturing, or can it be? So I think there's space in all of those things kind of to sort of weave through, especially when you take the gender out of it, which is what I love about the expansion of language and the inclusion of more people's experience. I'm going to say it that way because I don't think there's like an explosion of transgender people or an explosion of gay people. I think there's more inclusion of them, and including them in society gives everybody else more space to actually breathe and realize their fullness. Which is one of the things is why I think that there's such a backlash against it, because it's like if people can show their full expression, then you lose control over them. And I think that's what we're seeing in the patriarchy, is that like the more that there's inclusion, the more that people express, the more people are seen as being human, then that means the things I want to do to you, the things I want to control about you, become that much more difficult. So you need to get back in the box, or you need to be eradicated, one or the other.
Yeah. I wonder too if there's some sort of projection happening where it's or even like a very deep subconscious or unconscious resentment that people didn't have the same kind of freedoms to be who they wanted to be growing up. Like I can't imagine what it was like being my father growing up when he did, as like the second oldest of six boys. In his father was German. It was like it was a harsh world that he lived in, and he
Mhm.
didn't. If I ask him now what he would have been, his favorite color is lavender. What he would have been, instead of being a lawyer, he would have been a dancer, like, but that was never he was never given permission or felt safe to do that. And so I can imagine some sort of like unconscious resentment that I didn't get to do that. So therefore we're going to keep everyone in their lanes. And maybe it's not relevant, right, to figure out why there's such resistance to it. Um, it's probably likely that anyone who's deeply resisting it isn't listening to our podcast, and so it doesn't matter. But um, you said something to me that to just now that was interesting to me about the nurturing and the protecting. And I'll bring my dad back into the conversation real quick. You know, I'm staying at my parents' house, and we've been talking about like why Aiden prefers me to put him to sleep. And there's a whole saga behind all of that. But my dad just keeps coming back to, well, it's just different. A mother is just softer and more comforting, whereas a father is just more harsh and more of a disciplinarian. And that's just the way it is. And I think that for his world, like his generation, that was very true. And I don't think that that's always true in today's world. But from your perspective as a parent, um, how do you see yourself dancing between the protective and the nurturing? Because I do think I agree with you in that the protective is like the masculine and the nurturing is the soft. You know, the protective is that sort of like firmness, there's a boundary. It's like classic masculine, whereas the nurturing is softer. It's, you know, kind of like receiving what's going on versus trying to direct what's going on. And so, did that show up in your parenting at all?
So I think, from my own personal experience, I think I've sat in both of those places. And I think as time is moving on, my kid is now 14, she'll be 15 in a month. Um, I think it's a combination of things. So early, there was a lot of time spent with her. Like we split time where my wife, she worked 2 days, I worked 3 days. And, the other days the person was working, we spent time. So I think the time factor is probably a bigger thing. It's like how much time for me is able to be spent with my daughter, which shape and sort of relegate those sort of things. That there is more of that like full care, full nurturing, full experience. I mean, I'm still protecting, obviously, but at the same time, there's a lot more caring in terms of the amount of time when you're spending with your child that does that sort of aspect. School, now that she's in school, there's lots of time. The fact that I work and travel, those things sort of change that. So I think for me, it's more about how are we spending time together and what are we doing that really would define that sort of thing or give space for that to open up one way or the other. I don't necessarily think that a male presenting body cannot be a nurturing figure. I won't accept that, but I think that it also has to do with sort of both societal norms, expectations, and I almost go back to language, right? If you're talking about your father and his German experience, right? It was like he couldn't do those things, although they were in him, like society and family or whatever pressures were subjugating that. And I think that's the thing that we need to keep fighting against is like, what can we do to change? What can we do to fully be what we want to be? Like in our house, I do all the grocery shopping. I do a ton of the laundry. I do dishes, all the things that people would say, oh, that's domestic work that belongs to the woman. I do all those things. And when I grew up, going back to my upbringing, like I had responsibilities to, like every Saturday, I did the laundry for everybody in the house. I did dishes all the time, so like there was this, and I don't know if it was just because it was needed because it was a single parent family or if my mom just was like, you're going to work because you're here, like it's everybody's sharing the load, period. You're human, do it. So like I just grew up knowing that and, have taken that into my experiences as being an adult. And so I think that hopefully I'm also showing my daughter that like, when you find a partner, male, female, whatever, that your partner is also doing these things too. That you're not the one who's holding the bag and responsible for all these things. Um, yeah.
You mentioned earlier the moment when you were a teen and you felt the anger. surface for you and how you basically shut it down and said, this isn't appropriate. And I'll give sort of a caveat that my relationship to anger is unclear. And so I'm not an expert when it comes to um, how to embody it or when to embody it necessarily. It's something that I'm sort of curious about. But um, I wonder what your relationship to anger is now.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's complicated in the sense that, like, not that I don't get angry, because I do, like anybody else, but I don't really express it much. I pretty much kind of keep it to myself. It's not something that happens where I explode. Part of that story, which I glossed over, was that my father was a very demonstrative, sort of angry guy who could explode, and I was like, I don't want to be like my dad. Like, that was very clear. I didn't want to be like my dad. And so, I spent a lot of my life not being like my dad in that sense. Um, and I think for the most part, it has actually served me well. I think this is part of the thing that we were talking, I mentioned earlier about, like, having to navigate spaces, right? Or not being able to fully express yourself. So even though I would say, I think I have a full expression as a human, there are some things that I don't. I don't think that I can necessarily demonstrate being angry sometimes, because the perception is that being a black male, you're always angry, right? That you're dangerous, that you're violent, and so part of that is I've always had to sort of subdue that aspect because of society's definitions for me. Even though I tend to be more of a soft-spoken, caring sort of individual, like so here's another funny thing, right? I can walk into a bar and, like, people will move sort of for me, like, because I'm an angry black man. Like, I can get on the Amtrak and, like, nobody wants to sit with me, which is kind of nice, but nobody wants to sit with me because I'm the angry black man, right? So it's that sort of, like, perception of, like, what's happening, where it's like, those sort of things sort of come into play, and so because of that, sometimes there isn't the full expression of who I would be, because sometimes anger is appropriate. But I'm always conscious of what that is, what's the outward display, which is both fair and unfair, right? Like,
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like women have been saying for a while that they've never been given permission to experience anger, that if they do, then they're like a bitch, right? And it's inappropriate. There was actually a really great, I don't know if you shared that with me, Jennifer, but there was a really great Instagram meme about how, like, men are given permission to feel one emotion and it's like universally accepted, and it's anger. And it's kind of like nobody else, if you don't fit that sort of category, maybe it's white men, right? It's acceptable to experience and display anger, and we just sort of um yeah, give them that pass. And so I think that anger is an interesting subject. A lot of my female friends are sort of stepping into this position of, it's time for us to feel and express our anger. There
mhm.
was a woman I'd interviewed a couple years ago who had this performance where it was all about, like, women's rage and being able to experience rage. And um, I don't, I don't necessarily, I'm not driven to try to course correct necessarily, but I wonder if it's because I am very self-conscious about expressing my anger and the way other people would perceive me. And I don't know, Jennifer, if you have any experience or thoughts that you want to add about this notion of anger. And the reason that I feel like it's important to talk about, I'll just say, is because a lot of people talk about how unexpressed emotion can create and cause disease, or, um, inflammation in the body, etc. And so I'm always curious, like, am I causing harm by not expressing it? Do I just need to find a way to express it in the right form? I was actually talking to my therapist about this yesterday, so it's top of mind. um, but I'd be curious, Jennifer, to hear your thoughts about it.
I feel like I maybe like 10 years ago, I was like, no, I'm not angry. I never get angry. It's just not an emotion that I have, right? It was always like, what would I be angry about? And then becoming more aware and doing work on myself, I was like, oh, there is anger in here. And I have worked on ways to kind of just move that energy and not direct it at anyone, right? But just to kind of move it through my body. I have a place on the land here where I have old plates and dishes, and it's called Sacred Rage. And so when I have all of these things, you can just go out there and smash smash some dishes with the trees. I also say to my partner a lot, like, I'm not mad at you. I just need to scream, right? And then I'll grab the pillow and like scream into the pillow. So I have found ways to move it without like blasting it on to other people, which I think is something I've worked on with a lot of my different emotions, because I have a lot of things that come up and want to come out. And I've just been very conscious about making sure they're not just like thrown on the closest person possible, but they're still moving through me.
I just wanted to add because I think that that's really important because I'm glad that you said that about like not holding on to that energy and finding another way to let it go. And I also think that what you were saying, Teresa, reminded me about my daughter, and it was something that my wife was very much sort of informed me or taught me about. It was like that, girls are taught to be quiet all the time. And so, like, we very much have been like, let her express, let her do whatever, like, so that she knows that she has voice, she has agency, that she doesn't need to be quiet, that she can have those full expression of things. And so I think, that's another way that like we can care as parents for our children is like letting them have that space, much like my mother let me have that space. Um, and then the one thing that you had brought up earlier, Teresa, about the resentment that people might be experiencing because they didn't get to experience it. I don't know, and that just had me thinking about like a bit of like sadness for those individuals, but also in that sadness and recognizing it is even more of a reason why we need to embrace like living a full life or encouraging those that are in this time frame, this timeline, to have the fullest expression and supporting them. Because I think of some of the work that I've done in terms of like the homecoming, which is a project I've been doing where it's taking early recordings and mixing in with sound healing stuff, of reclaiming those voices of like enslaved Black people and sharecroppers. But then in those things, it's also, I think about the gifts, right? Like people that are forced to work, some sort of labor, right, that aren't isn't repaid in any sort of way. How many of them would have been something else, right? As opposed to just picking cotton. Like how many would have been a doctor? How many would have been a painter? How many would have been a dancer? How many would have been a weaver? Who would have been a monk? Who would have been like all these like amazing expressions of humanity that have been lost because of an oppressive system. And I don't think that, I think there's an intersectionality there. Like I think of like how many women have been forced to be at home bearing children that could have done or been other things that they wanted to be, and so I think that that's like our role right now as humans is to like let people express themselves as long as they're not harming another individual, like support expression and being. um, and I've learned that I'm not coming from like, oh my God, like I've always known this. It's more like, again, as language has opened up, as more people have been um, both oppressed and included, and you hear these arguments and these discussions, I'm like, no, like, let's really try to make that possible for people because I want it for myself. Like I want it for me. So if I want it, why shouldn't somebody else want it?
Yeah, this is sort of a little brainstorm here that I'm going to slip in, but it made me think. I have supported this organization in the past, Caring Majority Rising, which is largely about home health care, both the folks that need the home health care and the home health care workers. And it's all about advocating for them, getting them fair pay, all of that work. And I've always just found like that feels like such an important, it's like the center focus of care, right? I mean, everyone needs care, but these people need care all the time, all day long. And if like we could solve the problem of caring for them, that maybe there would be a rippling effect out. But society isn't there. Like whenever I share the stuff on social media, it is the least liked thing. Like none of my sphere is like paying attention or seemingly tuned into this stuff. And it frustrates me. And so I've been, sort of thinking about it, like why is this not a priority for everyone? And I have this sort of radical idea that maybe it's because all of the people on the other end of the spectrum aren't experiencing the care that they need, and so that we actually have to start with like the top down. And it makes me think about what we were talking a little bit before we started about the men's groups, and how we've had conversations with several guests how there isn't a lot of sympathy for the men's groups. They're largely white men's groups, because they've been given all the privileges of the world when it comes to wealth and power, but they haven't been given the space necessarily to connect to their heart and what their hearts truly desire. They've been fed this storyline of what success is and what would feel good if you achieve that success. And I think what many find out is that that's not necessarily true. And so, what if we helped the folks in power understand what it's like to truly feel free and be in touch with themselves? And if that is the way to then bring it into a bigger society. I don't expect either of you to have an answer for that or agree with me necessarily. Um, but it just makes me think about this conundrum of why are we stuck in this place of control over. um, Maybe it's just everyone needs therapy. I don't know.
Well, I'm gonna say one thing to that. I'm gonna say one thing to that statement. I think it is a good idea. It's a noble idea, but until power is willing to relinquish power, it's not going to change. Like if you have power, then there's no reason that you have to suffer. Like you can seek help, you can come together, you can figure it out, you can open up. The problem is that power doesn't want to give up any sort of aspect of that power, and therefore they are stuck in that situation until they hurt enough to want to change. It doesn't change unless there's an uprising, unless there's a revolt, which forces the change. But if power is suffering, I mean, we know power is suffering. We're experiencing it. Like the collapse of our society at this current moment, we're experiencing it. Um, like we have seen capitalism move to its extreme end. We've seen the grift really large, and yet people are still pretending that it's not. Like until there's enough suffering that people realize, what they're doing, it won't change.
As somebody who is a sort of a self-proclaimed, political enthusiast, maybe that's not what the language that you use, but you were, interested in poli sci and you pay attention to a lot of politics. Do you feel that your work is contributing to a solution to what's going on politically?
Ooh, that's a tough one. uh, Big part of me would say no, because I feel like there's much bigger work, but then it's also so much larger than us that I feel like it's a matter of doing what you can do on the small scale, right? That if we actually take care of the people in our community, the people in our sphere, yes, it will eventually, hopefully, change things. But does it feel like it? No. I feel like a totally like a small cog, not doing anything for anybody at all. And so, like, I'm not sure how that places out.
All right, let's get back to the feminine for a moment because I feel like I sidetracked us somehow and I don't know how. Um, but I'm good at that. And so back to your idea about the feminine and how it shows up in your world today. How do you embody it other than wearing rose scents and
No, I would say I feel at this moment that I would say that I embrace femininity in terms of my creative expression. I think that in terms of how I care for people and what I provide in terms of my profession in the world, I think my feminine energy is more about the mindful practices that I have and the ways that I want to show up in the world, like the desire to have a soft approach, even in my you know my rage and what have you, and those sort of expressions. That there's still a desire to see the other person in those moments, like to recognize, like I've been talking about, like the other, I see people, I see both the joy and the pain that people are living. I think that my desire is actually that people have good lives. And so I think that's kind of how the feminine's showing up for me, in my expression in the world.
One of the ways that we talk about the feminine is it being embodied. And I went through some of your journal posts and the quotes that you have on your website and even the work that you do. To me, it's very embodied. Can you speak to that a little bit and whether or not you include that expression in your idea of the feminine?
Oh, I mean, I definitely think that it's very much part of that. Whenever time I keep talking about connection or I talk about presence, um, I feel that that's part of our whole humanity. And I think that that is feminine energy, that we have both masculine and feminine in us, but it's that feminine energy that allows us to come to those places of being embodied, to be connected. Um, and it's interesting because actually you just made me think of something else. It's like part of that coming to be embodied and grounded and connected in yourself is so that you actually can take action and move, which would be the masculine energy, if you wanted to say it that way. I'm working on another project right now. That's why I came up. I'm working on a project called Still Point with a friend of mine, and it literally is about helping people to collect all of this stuff here and get it centered, and not centered in the sense of like then peace and calm and zen, but more centered so that you can actually take action and do the things that mean something to your life, that has importance to you. Um, so yeah, it's very much a part of that, and embodiment is definitely part of it. And that's the embodiment, then the creative expression, the movement, all those things kind of work together to sort of make that happen.
do you think that having um, maybe a greater than average for the male person um, connection and embodiment of the feminine, has it all been a problem for you?
I'll allow you to say greater than, because I don't know in comparison. But I will say my connection to femininity, has it been a problem for me? I think in some ways it has. I think in some ways I haven't fully expressed things at times. This would go back to almost you're saying, women don't express rage. I think I like I said, I haven't expressed those sort of things in ways. Um, I think in some ways I have not always stepped into a quote masculine role because of my connection to feminine energy. That, this understanding or this feeling of like, oh, I can do this or I should do this because that's what the expectation of me being male presenting, or that actually really is my role, is to do that. I
Can
think in
you
some
give an
ways, yeah.
example of that? Just like what you would say is a masculine role?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about societal roles, then we're talking about situations of like particular earning of money, right? Or aspects of, material things. Um, like I'm a massage therapist. It's one of the least respected, I mean, people love massage therapists, but it's not like it's a commanding, it's not like, so yeah, in those situations, that's actually, it's really interesting because I wasn't even thinking about this. Massage profession is dominated actually by female presenting bodies. I would say like probably 80%. I mean, I don't know the exact number, but I think it's well over 70% of, therapists, licensed therapists in the US are, women. So it's interesting in that aspect too, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I'm in a profession that's dominated by women. I will say that the teachers that get elevated though are the male teachers though. So there is that still that constant sort of like misrepresentation, that the teachers that are the authorities are often the male teachers. I will say that all the best teachers that I've taken were actually female instructors. So, but then again, I gravitate towards female energy, right? So,
Hmm.
um, yeah,
Before we run out of time, I wanted to make sure we talk about some of the specific projects that you're doing. You mentioned home. Um, are you still offering that? And you mentioned Still Point, and are there
yes.
other things that you're doing creatively that that we don't know about?
I think right now, Homecoming is on hiatus for a little bit. I just had a grant from Arts Mid Hudson, which really allowed me to present that in Hudson Valley. We did a number of virtual sessions and we did some in person. It's something that I've done twice a year. So it'll probably be back. Usually we do it during Black History Month. It just seems to happen in February. But yeah, I think it'll come back. I mean, it keeps growing and changing each time, which is such a lovely project in and of itself. And then Still Point is actually launching in October and, excuse me, September and October. So there'll be a workshop in New York City that is I'm doing with a friend of mine, Christine Grace. It's a project that we've been working on for a while now, and that's going to be launching in October in Boston and September in New York City. So, yeah, and then we're hoping to take that elsewhere.
Cool. And
And
is
will
that
that be, sorry,
go ahead, Jennifer.
I'm just wondering, is it an experience that people can come to? Is it an event? If you could just give a little bit
Oh,
more
yeah.
detail about how we interact with it.
Yeah, so I apologize. So Still Point actually it's an interactive workshop. It's a 2.5 hour workshop, including sound, breath work, and movement. Again, it's this whole idea of how do we bring all these parts of us that are like disparate, that are, out of control, and get centered with ourselves to realize our own resilience and resource, so that we can take action in the ways that we want. So we're talking political action. We're talking about just, caring for your home. We're talking about moving forward in your career, whatever it is that you're trying to do. We want to help create these sort of resource and a way for you to use these different modalities, these different mediums to come together and get yourself, centered in a way that you feel supported as you're doing it. Homecoming is virtual and in person. So yeah, that's also attendance. Homecoming is kind of more like a traditional sound bath, but it has these other elements of film and recordings so it's more almost like performance art, but it's really meant to be sort of like a woven dream that you are moving through in real time. And then just for a simple thing, which I totally forgot about, I'll be actually at Innisfree Garden in August for Gardens for Peace, which is, if you haven't been to Innisfree, you definitely need to go. It's my favorite garden up here in Hudson Valley. It's in Millbrook. It's a beautiful Japanese garden. It's worth going, whether I'm there or not. It is just worth going. But I'll be there. I think it's the second to last Saturday. We'll be doing Gardens for Peace, which is all about supporting. Um, well, it's actually about World War II and the bombing, but it's more about what comes after the war and all the men. So yeah, so we do a celebration of sound and experience the garden there.
What is your relationship to your creativity? Do you have like when you're working on, do these projects kind of come to mind or, in conversation with your collaborators, or do you have time where you're specifically like, I'm wanting to create something, let me go into my creative space, whatever that looks like, and see what's coming up next? Like, how does that flow for you?
Yeah, I wish it was more of the latter. I think for me, it's either projects that are presented to me or things that just come to me in a loose sort of sense. Like you mentioned the videos on Instagram and nature and stuff, and those were born out of the pandemic. Like honestly, they were born out of like being in my backyard, no place to go, and wanting to like do something, kind of like express and feeling my own sort of like despair, during that time. And so I started like looking at like small things. I like for me, I feel like the nature, the beauty of the world is such a vital force for us. It's such a vital resource. I can't help but like look at, I don't know, I just look at like where we live and what we do. And then I'm like, there's just so many things to be inspired by and to work through and to, I don't want to use the word use, but be inspired by and allow them to like give you, new directions, new path. And so I feel like there's always ideas and things to go, but I think it is like slowing down and taking the time to kind of like look around you, to be observant. Like sometimes I'll shoot a video and people are like, oh my God, that's so amazing. And I'm like, if you could see it literally, I'm standing by a bus stop and it's just like a little patch of grass. And I've slowed it down and I'm moving really, really slow. That this little patch of grass looks like this amazing field, but it's a little patch of grass by a bus stop underneath a metal sign, and it's just like, how do we like, so for me, it's like, how do we look at these small things and appreciate our lives? Like, because trust me, like everybody else, I get frustrated, things suck. So it's just like, how do I like look for something small that makes me happy in the moment and then share that?
Do you have practices other than that that are the things that you do to nurture yourself?
Yeah, I have a meditation practice. I do regular yoga, which has been really helpful for me. I just recently started going back to the gym, which is actually, I didn't realize how much I needed that. The idea of moving and like strengthening my body. I mean, I spent so much time moving people's bodies that like I wasn't working out for a long time, but I realized that I actually had discovered a pattern where my body is now kind of off and I need to strengthen it again. So yeah, so that's been really lovely in the last like month or so. I've like rediscovered that and I'm like, oh, okay, this is good for me. I feel much better. And then I would just say like for me, the other thing really is honestly just getting out, like being out in nature. You know, I'm actually going to be at it's just funny, it reminded me, I'm going to be at teaching a workshop on forest bathing at Uplift Festival, which is happening in 2 weeks in Menla. And yeah, so just the idea of like encouraging people to like again go out and be in nature, and we have a luxury of being in the Hudson Valley, but even if you're in the city, go out to Bryant Park, go to Central Park. If you can't get that far, find a tree and hug it. Like touch nature, like let it be a part of you, let it absorb, some of the shit that you're dealing with, and let it just like care for you. We didn't talk
Is that
about that,
something
but
that you've done? But
no, I'm
is
just
that
thinking
something
nature
that
is
you've
that big
done?
feminine energy. Sorry, that's what I was when I was thinking
Yeah,
about that. Like touching
yeah,
nature
yeah,
is like big feminine energy that like helps us.
yeah,
And have I
yeah.
done what? I'm
Well,
sorry.
and I mean, I think the thing about nature to me that is we call Mother Earth, right? It's like the feminine, but the earth embodies all yin and yang, everything. But there's something about the earth and being in nature in the moment is where you see how it changes. And to me, that's the feminine. There's not, yes, there's rigid parts, like a rock is very firm and a tree can be, but there's cycles, there's movement. Um, and that to me is, I think, an important reminder to ourselves
Hmm.
that things do change and sometimes the change is hard and not what we want, or it can be an end to something. um but that's how I think of nature and how it really does embody the feminine in that way, other than the obvious we say Mother Earth. But I'd be curious to know if your relationship to nature is something that you've had since from a young age.
I mean, I grew up in a time when we weren't on computers and phones and stuff.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I was kicked outside and, go play and, ride your bike and do that kind of thing. So in a general sense, I think so. Yeah, I think there's always been that space for it. I think, you know, I think once I came up here first, I went to SUNY New Paltz, but I think when I came up here and really saw nature in its expanse is probably when I had the bigger appreciation for that. You know, but yeah, I think, and I think just like anything, I think this is all accessible to all of us. I don't think that people aren't, have that ability. I don't think I'm special.
Mhm.
I just think that I'm paying attention, and encouraging that in others.
Well, I think that's the what I'm seeing and maybe recognizing is it can be hard for folks to feel like connecting to nature. Like a lot of people aren't drawn to it, you know? They go from their house to their car to the office to the gym back home, and there's so little communing with nature. I think that is part of the reason that we are in sort of this place of disconnection, you might say, right?
Hmm.
And the extreme damage that we're doing to the earth. I think it's because a lot of people aren't drawn to it. So I was curious about what was the thing, if there was a moment that inspired you to, or if it just sort of happened innately. I think being in the Hudson Valley, because it is so majestic, you can't help but be like awestruck by it in a sense. And there probably are more people up here that are attuned to it than maybe in New York City.
Well, it's funny because actually, I was going to actually argue the other point in that sense because I think you just described the average person that lives in Hudson Valley, right? Car, work, gym, home,
Mm.
right? And I think it's because you do live here that people don't appreciate it, right? It's like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, there's the mountains. Yeah, okay, that's where the mountains are. They always were there, right? So
Yeah.
I actually think it's quite the opposite. And I think the reason is because we're caught in that rat race of like achieving, doing productivity, blah, blah, blah. And so we miss nature. We miss it, even though if we're absorbed in it and like it's totally surrounding us. I think a lot of people in Hudson Valley are not actually doing it. But I do agree with you that that's a disconnect. That as humans, that's the big disconnection is that people aren't in tune with nature in such a way that they realize that they are a part of it and it's not something to be here. It's actually something that's here, right? And so, yeah. So
Yeah,
I was gonna say.
I agree with you. I do agree with you. And I'm also recognizing that like during COVID, similarly for me, was a time that I had so much more time. So I was in nature all the time. I would sit by the creek every day, all of this. And now it my life feels so full that if I go outside, I'm like, how do I maximize my exercise? I'm going to do the hill over and over and over again. I'm not meandering through the woods and pausing by the stream because I've got to get back home to do whatever. So I'm agreeing with you. It makes me want to ask, how do you slow down? And do you have to consciously do that? Do you have to create the space to be still in moments? And you said you have a meditation practice, but is there a way that you curate your life so that you have space to do that?
I wish I could say I do. I don't curate my life. I think that I'm lucky enough that I have spaces where I'm like, oh, that looks pretty, and I'm going to stop. It's more that
Mm.
I actually think that I should curate my time better. But it's funny because that's actually something that I'm really working on as far as my productivities. I feel like I'm like, and I've got all these projects, and I'm like, and there's lots of things that are falling apart. Constantly, so I'm always like kind of like I'm just holding on to what I'm holding on to at the moment. But luckily enough, I will in the chaos of getting from point A to point B, I will sometimes just stop and be like, oh, I actually have an hour or I have 20 minutes and I'm going to do this, like, and that I feel is one of the luxuries of living here is that like you can stumble upon beauty and nature and space if you give yourself even that recognition of that, oh, I can do that. Like sometimes I've gone past like a swimming hole and I'm like, oh, I know that swimming hole. And I'm like, oh, and I can stay here for like 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And so I'll do that. But it's not a conscious decision that like I should go, as a consistent thing. Um, but I'll put that on my productivity list of one more thing to do.
No, 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 not at all. I think actually what the way you're describing it reminds me of sort of the meditator's mind, which is, being in the moment. And it doesn't mean you have to carve out 2 hours for space, right? It can be, being in that 1 or 2 minute, 10-minute moment throughout the day, which uh, to me feels like a more natural flow than trying to curate always, and not to belittle or sort of devalue the masculine being the structure. If we do notice ourselves going way too far off course, then we bring that structure back in, but
Mm.
not too much, because then we miss those moments.
I'll just add, I woke up early this morning and decided to go outside. And I spent maybe just 5 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, watching the huge bumblebees jump onto like the clovers and the plantains and then have it flop over. You know how they just like buzz around and like, woo, the whole thing falls over. And I was just like, I could watch this all day long. It was so fun to watch them just like buzzing and to hear the sound too of the bees
Mm.
is like a big part of that experience as well. So yeah, I'm just promoting the like you don't need a ton of time. You just need a couple of minutes and you can really drop in if you're paying attention.
And then we'll see that on your Instagram later, right?
Yeah.
Like little bee videos. Yes,
Coming
I'm
soon.
gonna look for that. I'm gonna look for those.
So folks can find you at handandtemple.com, and your Instagram is similarly named, but I'll link to all of that in the show notes. Do you want to, is it HND? What's your Instagram?
Yeah. My Instagram is HND_TMPL. So basically, it's Hand and Temple, no vowels. And if you're looking for any of the things I'm doing, that's actually the best place I've used to keep that totally up to date. Probably more up to date than my website. So my Instagram, if you go to my link in bio, it has all the things that I'm doing, things that are coming up. You can also connect to me that way. DM if you have questions, concerns, thoughts. Yeah, it's all good.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for making time, giving us your time today. It's been really lovely to sit down and chat. It would have been nice if we were in person, but I'll take this too.
I'll see you soon. Thank you both. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you, Ben.